when you compare our First Amendment from 1789 with Article 18 from 1945, the language is really incomparable, but the same sort of components are there. It's an individual right to pursue truth as one's conscience leads. There's no role for government to play in deciding what is truth in a religious sense. Individuals are free to manifest that belief peacefully, alone or in a community. They can share their beliefs. They can teach others. They can meet for worship. And they have the right to hold no belief. That's a very important component. And they have the right to change belief. And I think now, as we look at the 21st century and the situation for global persecution, the language of Article 18 is even more important because it's such a specific enunciation of all the different components of what it means to enjoy religious freedom. With the United States, because we're so large and powerful, we are a superpower, I think it's important that we work to advance human rights across the board for everybody everywhere. And with that comes promoting freedom of religion or belief. The law that Congress passed did create a special blacklist of the worst violators of religious freedom called Country of Particular Concern. And so the State Department every year will decide which countries are particularly severe violators of religious freedom, where it's systematic, ongoing, and egregious. And they name these countries to this list. So North Korea, China, Eritrea, and there's 10 total now, Pakistan. And that's a very powerful diplomatic tool that the United States government can use to encourage reform when perhaps there isn't an incentive otherwise to improve things. And I know from my time at the State Department, I was involved in negotiations with Sudan and Uzbekistan, who were both on this blacklist. And that gave us important leverage to encourage them, especially when these new governments came in and they wanted to turn the page. They wanted to have a better relationship with the United States. Because they were on this list, that gave us leverage to encourage them to make desperately needed reforms on registration laws, on church building laws, on letting people out of jail, on criminal penalties. So I think that's a unique part of how America does diplomacy on earth issues. That is a great question, and the answer is situation specific. So, in an authoritarian context, the dictator is afraid of any independent activity because they want to be in control. Their time horizon is not 100 years, 10 years, it's tomorrow morning. For a dictator, they want to make sure they're alive and in charge when they wake up the next day. And so any independent activity, be it political or religious, labor, whatever, they're worried about. Many authoritarian governments remember the role of Pope John Paul II in Poland, and they saw the power of religion, they saw the power of faith in pushing back against authoritarianism, and they've learned that lesson and they cracked down on it. So at one end, you just have fear of losing power, but in other contexts, you do have an animosity towards a different faith, a competing faith. In many authoritarian contexts, there's often an established faith that is more of a prop, a legitimizer of the dictatorship than an actual independent expression of religious truth. And so when missionizing groups come in, or evangelizing groups, or just communities of thought communities within the majority faith saying, why do we have to listen to this government stooge who's dressed up as a religious leader? Then a crackdown can happen. I've also seen it when proselytizing communities come in of a different faith background, the clampdown can be very severe, and individuals can be put in jail just for sharing their faith. People can be put in jail for changing faith. And I've always thought, the crime of conversion, and I put that in quotation marks, is an odd one when you really think about it, because the person who has broken the law, who is converted, is actually very happy because they have found truth and they want their life to go in a different direction. So the victim is not the person who's being penalized. They're actually quite pleased with their life choices. So it's some idea of communal stability, communal harmony. And I understand that. I do understand that, people changing religions can create social tension at a local level, at a family level. But that's the reality of the 21st century. Ideas and information are flowing like never before in human history. People are moving and interacting in ways that were unfathomable 25 years ago. And so we have to learn how to live with others that are different than us. We have to learn how to accept people choosing different life paths that are either a different religion or no religion. And if we can't figure this out, then our future is going to be one of conflict and human rights abuses. That's a really interesting question that I've thought about. And I in my work in the Middle East, when I was at the State Department, I saw this surprising dynamic of where the more democratic a country was in the Middle Eastern context, usually the weaker the protections were for religious freedom. And the more authoritarian they were, then there was stronger protections for freedom of worship and minorities. Neither were ideal, but I was comparing like Kuwait, which is has a parliament, has this interesting relationship between elected officials and the monarchy. There's this desperate need for more churches for the expatriate community. And the parliament refuses to permit the building of new churches because we're a Muslim country or Muslim majority and the people don't want it. Even though the monarchy is for it, they're hamstrung by their democratic elected leadership. You look at UAE, which is a monarchy that doesn't have the democratic component in the same way that Kuwait does. They're building a church, a synagogue, and a mosque next to each other in the capital of Abu Dhabi. And that's a wonderful example of interfaith understanding and coexistence. So that's going to be an issue that we'll have to continue to engage with, all of us who work in the space of freedom of religion and belief, to how to navigate promoting religious freedom in both an authoritarian or democratic context, because both have their challenges, but in distinct and different ways. There's always going to be a tension between competing priorities, especially for a country as large as ours, as the United States. While we have this unique commitment to promoting human rights, religious freedom, other rights as part of our diplomacy, we also are engaged in economic and trade issues, security issues, military issues, and a whole host of other types of challenges. And so, yes, there will at times be a break between American values and American practices, because international relations is a very difficult space to operate in. Russia, China, they don't burden themselves with having concerns about human rights. We do. In a certain sense, that hampers our diplomacy. It limits our freedom of movement. But at the same time, I wouldn't want it any other way as an American. I want our country to be promoting these concepts of freedom and liberty and rights of the individual, in part because that's who we are as a country, but also because it actually makes a better world. Countries that respect the human rights of their citizens are going to be better trade partners. They're going to honor their contracts. They're going to be better. We'll have common values. I think that's why the transatlantic relationship is so important and so vital, because Europe and North America, the US and Canada, we do have this common lineage, common concept of liberty at a time when we see China exporting a very different view of what government and its citizenry's relationship should be, Russia being Russia. So yeah, it's hard. There are charges of hypocrisy that sometimes are true. But at the same time, the United States has an unparalleled commitment to promoting human rights that is really second to no other country in the world. One level, the promotion of religious freedom has been a consistent topic across all administrations, Republican or Democratic, partially because it's mandated in law, but also because it's an American value and it's just part of our diplomatic engagement. Now, the Trump administration made it a priority in a way that no other administration had before, Republican or Democratic, by convening the two ministerial meetings, these two summits in Washington, creating the International Religious Freedom or Belief Alliance. So they really elevated the issue globally in a way that had never been done before. At the same time, there were these other policies that I found very troubling, like the Muslim ban and basically ending our refugee resettlement program, that limited sort of the long-term impact of those efforts, I thought. But so we'll see how the Biden administration picks up this issue. Secretary Blinken released the International Religious Freedom Report maybe 2 months ago, gave a very strong speech, criticized our partner, Saudi Arabia, for being the only country in the world without a church, talked about challenges in a country like Nigeria, but also explained how, in his view, religious freedom should be viewed as part of a broader human rights engagement and not singled out. And that is a break from how the Trump administration focused on the issue. You know, one of the things I've observed over the years is how members of the LGBT community, converts, and atheists, and in many contexts around the world, suffer from the same type of government persecution and societal persecution. Like, they all have to hide. It's all very dangerous for them to talk about this part of who they are, out of fear of, like, they will go to jail, they'll be murdered, they'll be kicked out of their home. And so this community of vulnerability exists, but there is very little, if any, points of connection between those three groups or their advocates. And so I'm actually working on some research looking at the commonality of challenges between the LGBT community, converts, and the ethical humanist community, because countries that persecute converts usually persecute members of the LGBT community. Countries that criminalize atheism criminalize conversion, and certainly gay marriage and like that would not be permitted. So if we're going to see success, I think it's trying to bring all three of these together, because then we would be marshaling really an unprecedented alliance of advocates from across the political spectrum, from across the religious spectrum, that hopefully could start to bring about results in a way that we haven't seen to date. I think we're at that sort of hinge point in history where it could go either way. Because of this new reality of people and different communities coming together like never before in human history, we're at a moment where we can either, as a world community, figure out how to live together with people who think and believe and look different than ourselves, or we can fail in that and then be grappling with human rights violations and instability for decades to come. So this is where it's incumbent on elected officials, government leaders, faith leaders, laity in churches and mosques and synagogues and temples, and people who hold no faith, to be leaders in their own community, to try to build bridges between people, to reach out to the other, whatever that means in their context, to stand up for their neighbors when they're experiencing human rights violations, to not just be focused on our own, but to be focused on our neighbors. If we can take that approach, if we can think about our neighbors and what they're experiencing and be advocates for their rights as much as we would for our own community, then that's hopeful. Then that means I think we will get to a place where humanity has maybe never been before. But that's going to be hard. That goes against the lessons of history. That goes against thousands of years of lived experience of humanity, where people are often afraid of the other. And so this is the moment where we have to decide which way we're going to go. I'm hoping it's one where it's based on inclusivity and human rights, but it's important that we all do everything we can to bring that day about.